So, first of all, I want to ask all of you, do any of you already know what Wicca is? Are any of you practicing Wiccans? And what can you tell me about Wicca before we dive in? Feel free to answer in the chat or by unmuting yourself and talking.
I tend to follow the Wiccan traditions, but I don't call myself Wiccan. I know it was started, I believe, in the 70s by James Gardner, and it is kind of based around an actual religion. And it is a known religion in, I know the United States, but I'm not sure about the rest of the countries. I think it's been established as a known religion. But it's, just nature-based. And I don't know, I tend to call it like the hippie witchery.
Awesome.
So
thank you.
That's about all I really know right now, like off the top of my head. So
thank you so much, Becca. That was great. Yes.
yeah.
Awesome. So we also have people who have answered in the chat who have said that it is an organized religion started by Gerald Gardner. Awesome. And also we had a question, and I want to address this question, but we are going to get into this. This is going to be part of the controversial discussion that we have about 20 minutes into class. So Black Sheep, you posted in the chat, what is the difference between white and dark witches? So that is a fantastic question. Thank you so much for asking, because we are going to go over that question. But not yet, but I will circle back to that. Thank you so much for asking. We also had someone who said, I know some. I have been practicing tarot and becoming familiar with my crystals and herbs in a few books. Oh, that's awesome, Megan. Thank you so much for sharing. So, yes, Wicca. So, Wicca is a religion. It is considered a neo-pagan religion. It is one of the largest of the modern neo-pagan religions. And usually people who are Wiccan identify as witches, but some don't. And they draw a lot of inspiration from pre-Christian religions of Europe. But different traditions of Wicca, especially ones that have evolved over time, are inspired by religion or by pagan spiritualities from all over the world. So it publicly emerged in England in the 1950s, but historically, and historians have found records of Wicca emerging slightly before that. But the person who did make it popular and made it spread wide throughout England was Gerald Gardner. Yes. So usually followers of Wicca use the pentagram or a 5-pointed star as the main symbol of their religion. But so many different branches of Wicca have emerged in modern times, and some of them do not use the pentagram or the 5-pointed star. As Wicca evolves, it is changing very rapidly and very quickly. There are lots of different branches that we are going to talk about today as well. And a lot of them take inspiration from multiple cultures from all over the world, multiple open practices from all over the world, and symbolism and symbols from all over the world. But when it very first started in the 1950s, it was mostly pagan European pagan practices that they took inspiration from, and the person who was most known for making this religion popular was Gerald Gardner. So, Gardner spent most of his career in Asia, where he became familiar with various indigenous religious traditions. He also read widely in Western esoteric literature, including the writings of British occultist Aleister Crowley. So, Gerald Gardner took a lot of inspiration from Asian, and it's really hard for me to just say Asian because that is a gigantic continent. But sadly, in Gerald Gardner's writings, he just uses the word Asian, which is why a lot of times there's a lot of criticism of Gerald Gardner. Because in his writings, if you read Gerald Gardner's books, you will see that a lot of times when he talks about the different indigenous practices that he was inspired by, you will find that he was inspired by many Celtic traditions, by many Scandinavian traditions, by many ancient European traditions, including Strega witchcraft in Italy, as well as what he calls Asian traditions. From reading his books, you will find that he's probably talking about India, the Middle East, and China, but he does not necessarily specify. So, that is Gerald Gardner and the beginning of Wicca. So, as you all know, I'm sure, Great Britain and England, or Great Britain in general, had a lot of archaic laws surrounding witchcraft. We have a lot of classes on the genocide of indigenous people throughout Europe when it comes to pagans and pagan practitioners. But for now and for this class, we are just going to say they had archaic witchcraft laws. But really what it was an enormous genocide throughout all of Europe, and the spread of Christianity. But following the repeal of those archaic witchcraft laws in 1951, Gardner published Witchcraft Today, and it came out in 1954. He founded his first coven of followers, and with the assistance of High Priestess Doreen Valiente, they developed what became known as Gardnerian Wicca. So, if any of you have read Witchcraft Today, I do recommend reading the book if you are interested in Wicca. But I will warn you, if you are reading this as someone who is just someone who is from, a modern person in 2023, you will be able to tell very, very quickly that there's a lot of archaic terminology there when they refer to indigenous practices, when they refer to indigenous religions, the use of the word savage, the use of a lot of words that we would just not use today when describing indigenous practices and indigenous people. A lot of those were used in his book, Witchcraft Today. He also is he's known to be obsessed with this idea of a very binary idea of witchcraft. So, for example, Wiccans who follow Gardnerian Wicca, and the type of Gardnerian Wicca that has not evolved since 1951, they refer to the god and the goddess, and that being female energy and male energy, and that every coven has a high priest and a high priestess. And they talk about how the power of the goddess, the power of the high priestess, stems from her womb, and that the power of the high priest will stem from, I forgot what word choice they use, but of course, the power of the high priest stems a lot from his masculine energy and a lot of phallic terminology for his male genitalia. And so, of course, that has a lot of controversy surrounding it as well, especially because a lot of the indigenous practices that they took from when discussing masculine and feminine energy, it is said that Gerald Gardner, of course, didn't really understand. And this is more of an ideology. Masculine and feminine energy was never supposed to mean a man and a woman. It was supposed to be a philosophical theology and a philosophical ideology describing a dichotomy of energies that exist within the universe. It was never supposed to mean a woman and a man. As we know today, a lot of indigenous practices, historians have learned that they had hundreds of different genders, and that the idea of masculine and feminine energy was never meant to be binary. So other occultists drew on Gardner's writings and on other texts about witchcraft to establish their own Wiccan traditions during the 1950s and 60s. All of them typically claimed to be practicing a pre-Christian witchcraft religion that had survived for centuries, that had been around for thousands and thousands of years. A lot of old Wiccan writings, you will find that it's like they are rediscovering a religion that has been around for 5,000 years. And historians have found that, of course, that is not the case. Wicca is a new religion. It is a new religion that took different parts of different indigenous practices and spiritualities and mixed them together to create a new spirituality. And we are going to talk about people's feelings on that. I don't think there is a right or wrong answer necessarily to whether that is good or bad. I think that there are many, many aspects of it that are good and many aspects of it that are bad. And we're going to talk about that. So amongst the most prominent of those occultists that took inspiration from Gerald Gardner and created branches of Wicca. So now we don't just have Gardnerian Wicca. Towards the 60s and 70s, we started to get Alexander Sanders, of course, who founded Alexandrian Wicca. And then we have the California-based Victor Anderson and Cora Anderson, who spearheaded the fairy tradition of Wicca. So I would love to know, since it did seem like one of you knew what Gardnerian Wicca was, is there anybody in this class who knows what fairy Wicca is or knows what Alexandrian Wicca is?
I don't recall learning about either of those. So.
Cool.
Well, I don't know. I think of fairy Wicca. When you say fairy Wicca, I think of someone that works with like magical fairies and stuff like that. But that's what the first thing that came to my mind when you said.
No, that's awesome. Yes, and that's a huge part of it. So you're not wrong at all. So awesome. And yes, you are right. Your name just shows up on Zoom, by the way, in the chat as English. And but yes, you are correct. You wrote in the chat that Gardnerian and Alexandrian are some of the best known schools of Wicca. You are correct. Most people know of Alexandrian and most people know of Gardnerian, even if they don't know what they are or where they came from. They, especially in the Western world, if we are talking about Europe and the United States, those are probably the most well-known forms of Wicca. Fairy Wicca was developed by Cora and Victor Anderson, and we are going to learn about that today as well. But let's move on. So Gardnerian Wicca, as we already kind of talked a little bit about Gerald Gardner. Gerald Gardner, also known by the craft name Skyer, was an English Wiccan, as well as an author and an amateur anthropologist and archaeologist. When they say amateur, so there's so much controversy around this, and I love putting this into my slides and bringing this up, because in his books, he calls himself a amateur anthropologist and archaeologist. There aren't records showing that he has degrees or huge amounts of experience in these fields. Gerald Gardner has shown some things that have referenced that maybe he worked as an archaeologist or even mentored with an archaeologist for a few years, that he worked with a team of archaeologists at one point. He has some pictures of himself working with a team of archaeologists. But really what historians are starting to realize is that what he might mean by amateur archaeologist is grave robber, is that he would go to a lot of different places, especially throughout Europe, throughout Egypt, and throughout different parts of Asia, and just kind of dig stuff up. Or he would pay to join tours with archaeologists, where he would dig up stuff on sites and things like that. But he wasn't like an actual professional paid archaeologist. So he was instrumental in bringing contemporary pagan religion, or the contemporary pagan religion of Wicca, to public attention, writing some of its definitive religious texts and founding the tradition of Gardnerian Wicca, as we already talked about. So this is Cora Anderson. So Cora Anderson, or Cora Anderson Fairy, sometimes spelled F-E-R-I, is an American form of witchcraft that traces its lineage to Victor and Cora Anderson, influenced by a variety of indigenous folk magical traditions. Fairy witchcraft emphasizes bardic, shamanic, and ecstatic practices. Fairy witches celebrate embodiment and human sexuality in all consensual forms. And fairy is often considered to be queer, not just because of its embrace of alternative sexualities, but because of its fundamental orientation towards otherness and the uncanny. So what's wonderful about Cora and Victor Anderson, which a lot of people love to bring up when there are controversial discussions about Wicca, is that Cora was inspired by Gardnerian Wicca, but very turned off by this idea of the binary, of there only being two genders, and of there being this big emphasis on needing a man and a woman in ritualistic practice. And also of the very heterosexual ideologies that Gerald Gardner held close, because a lot of Gerald Gardner's practices were very focused on the fact that a god and a goddess created a sacred space. And not only that, but that the earth in itself was a womb, that the sun was masculine energy, and therefore they gave birth to what we know as all things in the universe. Yes, it's supposed to be metaphorical, but all of his metaphors are very heterosexual. All of his sex magic was very heterosexual. All of his ritualistic discussions were very heterosexual. And you could tell that there was absolutely no mention of any form of homosexuality in any of his teachings at all. Strictly kind of the opposite. And Cora and Victor were very against that. And they were like, look, we love Wicca, but also they were bi, and they wanted to embrace all people of all sexualities, of all genders, of all everything. And so they created this this form of Wicca that was very based in being yourself, and they had their own gigantic pride movements. They fought for a lot of gay rights back in the 50s and 60s, and they started to kind of turn Wicca into a political movement that was very liberal and very much in support of all of the beautiful gender movements and the beautiful pride movements and all of those things. And they made it very much about equality and being queer and being weird as well. One of their big things was about being very weird and naked in the middle of the forest, being yourself, letting your weirdness show, and having these rituals that were very based on sex and having fun and doing really weird and exciting things, and all their otherness and letting it show. And whereas Gerald Gardner was very much about a man and a woman being equal, but that's kind of where it ended. that was about as far as he was going to go towards any of these movements or anything that would have been considered progressive.
And that's, I think, why a lot of, even, nowadays in modern times, why people have such a negative connotation towards witches, because of their own fear in their mind about anything other than heterosexuality, and talking about how the witches out there doing orgies and blah blah blah, and they don't you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that's why we still get such this connotation from modern society, that it shouldn't be such a bad thing anymore. But I think that does contribute to a lot of it.
I agree. And I think too that a lot of times when people talk about, I don't know, a lot of the imagery that people get when they think of witches, I think that so many people think that they're from ancient medieval times, which yes, a lot of them are. A lot of them are from ancient and medieval times, but a lot of them are from Cora and Victor Anderson. And the giant orgies that they had in the middle of the woods, and the big, huge rainbows that they would scatter everywhere, and all of the nakedness and the dancing under the moon and being weird and cackling and just kind of being yourself and letting yourself be whoever you wanted. And I think that a lot of people, just imagery of witches comes from them, even though they don't know that it comes from them and from their coven. Okay. So I am reading the chat. Give me 1 second. Oh, it's Paul. Okay, cool. Good to know. Hi, Paul. Yep, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yep, that's the book that she wrote. It is a great book for fairy Wicca. Yes. So Paul referenced The Heart of the Initiate, Fairy Lessons, which is a great book reference on fairy Wicca. Yes, definitely. People are fearful of so many different things that witches have done, which is why I said we were going to get to this idea of evil witches and dark magic. We are going to get there pretty much right after Cora Anderson. And yes, They do sound like a blast, and they were a blast. And I think that sometimes when people discuss Wicca, we have to remember that there are so many different branches. We cannot just talk about Gardner and his practices. We have to talk about all of them if we are going to critically analyze Wicca as a religion. There are many branches. People do fear what they don't understand. I agree. So that's the thing. So Deb said, I think what you were saying was when you say indigenous people, can you repeat where it originated again? So the reason that you did not hear me say where it originated is exactly the problem. I didn't. And that's the problem. That is one of the big, gigantic problems we are going to talk about Wicca, even about the lovely Cora and Victor Anderson, is that all I said was that they focus on indigenous folk magical traditions. I did say bardic and shamanic and ecstatic practices, but there are a lot of those. And I didn't say which tribe, and I didn't say where, for a reason. And just using the broad word shaman and shamanic, is that really okay? Even though shamans exist throughout many different places of India, Indonesia, the Middle East, and throughout many different places, especially throughout East Asia and South Asia. And is it really okay to just say indigenous folk magic when there are thousands of indigenous cultures that practice folk magic? You will notice this terminology a lot, and I am not doing it because I don't think that we should say where it's from. I am doing it because Wicca as a religion does not state who they took these practices from, which is a problem, and a big problem, and a big controversial topic that we are going to talk about. So thank you for asking that question, because I cannot answer it. So a little bit more about Cora and Victor. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but so they do have a really cute little love story that kind of helped them to get popular very quickly and help their practices to get popular very quickly, is that they talk a lot about the astral plane and about the fairy portal and the portal to the fairy world and fairy circles. They actually said that Cora and Victor met in 1944 while Cora was working at a shop in an army camp in Oregon. The two recognized each other from a previous meeting on the astral plane, and they were married 3 days later. They said that they have all these beautiful stories about how they've known each other for 20 years and that they used to hang out every single day, and they grew an entire romantic relationship in the astral plane while astral projecting. After their marriage, Victor initiated Cora, and they devoted themselves to the worship of the goddess and her consort. So, just like I had said already, they loved all sexual orientations, and they made a big deal about it. And they were very loud, and they joined protests, signed petitions. They were involved politically in their community to help fight for the rights of the LGBTQIA community, of all genders, all orientations, and all of that. Unlike in British Wicca, where gender polarity and heterosexual fertility magic are centerpieces, the Andersons downplayed the centrality of polarity. So not only did they downplay it, After a while, they completely eliminated it. They completely took out the idea of polarity completely. They didn't believe in it. They actually feature in their creation myth, in their form of Wicca, they feature a goddess who contains all genders within her. And they do not say she contains 2 genders within her. What the book says is they contain all genders within them. Which, you know, for the 1960s, that was pretty cool. So they go back and forth in their book between using pronouns her, she, and they. And she also has sex with herself while they use the pronouns she, her. And that is how she gives birth to the universe, is by making love to herself. So they practice a lot of sex magic. Life force is inherently erotic. So if you were going to be initiated into this form of Wicca, you would have to just understand and be okay with the fact that a lot of their practices were going to surround masturbation. The way that you build energy is going to be by masturbating. The way that you create sigils, the way that you create rituals, the way that you create potions and magic and spells, the way that you build all forms of energy is going to be through pleasuring yourself and pleasuring others and all of that. So they say in their books and in their speeches that they draw on Afro-Caribbean traditions and Hawaiian-inspired Huna and Appalachian folk magic, and much more. So once again, as we kind of talk about that, they don't tell you which tribe. They say, you know, at least they are, unlike Gerald Gardner, they are actually listing kind of actual cultures, whereas Gerald Gardner uses kind of terms like African and Asian. And when, you know, Africa and Asia are entire continents. So saying that he takes inspiration from indigenous African practices doesn't, that's a continent, dude. So there are tons and tons and tons and tons of countries there as well. Not only are there tons of countries, but there would have been thousands of indigenous tribes. So yeah, so at least Cora says things like Appalachian folk magic and Afro-Caribbean traditions. She doesn't say which Afro-Caribbean traditions or what specifically they took from Hawaiian-inspired Huna, or what they took specifically from Appalachian folk magic.
I think the reason why I'm kind of getting the reason why you're saying that it's a problem is because some of these might be closed practices and they didn't think about that then, right?
That's one of the reasons. Right after this slide is we're gonna dive into why this is a problem. But yes, that is one of the huge problems. Yes. So the Andersons drew their religion from many cultures, but significantly, they continued to acknowledge the sources of their borrowing, rather than stripping them of their cultural context, which was something that was very special about Cora. Additionally, the two created new material to weave their diverse sources into a coherent whole. So let's start, I think, is that, yeah, okay. So before we get to this, hold on, let me read the chat. Okay. Oh, thank you for letting me know, Black Sheep. Yep, exactly, Sarah, exactly. Exactly. And yeah, thank you, Kumi. Exactly. Asia and Africa has a giant monolith. Exactly. So problematic. Exactly. And then Ed says, what does it mean if I've seen someone astral project? Like it was my ex-girlfriend. So just to briefly answer your question, Ed, so astral projection, and having somebody visit you isn't a bad thing at all. And all it means is that your ex-girlfriend was probably using astral projection to come visit you, and that the way that her appearance was in the astral plane was as a child and as a kid. That's probably all it means. And if she was somebody who practiced astral projection, even if she didn't know what she was doing, there wasn't anything scary or bad that could happen from that. She was just probably traveling and didn't really know where she was traveling or how to control it. But actually, that's kind of a great segue into discussing and talking about this idea of dark magic and good magic, or as a lot of people like to call it, black magic and white magic, which we really need to stop using that terminology. It's very racist. Let's not use that. So from now on, instead of using that, I am going to use evil magic and good magic. Now, yes, we can use the term shadow magic as well. Yes, but let's try to stay away from using the terminology black magic and white magic. It stems from a lot of racism, especially during the genocide of a lot of indigenous cultures. So before people start reading this and asking questions, let's go back here. So let's discuss and talk about this. I want to have a discussion and bring this to the table during this class. First of all, after I gave you that big speech, I know we did not talk about Alexandrian. The only reason that we didn't go too far into that, which we will talk about it in this class, is that Alexandrian is much more ceremonial and takes a lot more from Aleister Crowley. And we kind of already have an entire class on the YouTube about Aleister Crowley and Alexandrian and ceremonial magic. So today I kind of wanted to focus on the difference between Cora and Gardnerian. So the difference between fairy and Gardnerian. And so let's talk about the pros and cons. And first, let's start with the pros of Wicca, because there are a lot, and I feel like it gets a lot of criticism, as it rightfully deserves. But let's talk about the pros first. So what do you guys think so far that we have learned about? What are some of the pros of Wicca, especially in the 50s and 60s? And thank you, Paul. That's exactly where we are getting. By the way, spoiler, when we get to talking about dark magic and or good magic and evil magic, there isn't any. That is the answer to your question. I wanted to kind of have a discussion, and we will, but there is no such thing. Magic is just magic. But
I think the pros, it provided a structure. It provided a like a coven type of energy that people could come together and practice their religion or their witchcraft, and kind of like a safe space within those religions for the people who practiced that way.
Yes, I love that. And I love that you brought that up because exactly. We are talking about the 50s, and the 50s in Great Britain and even in the United States was not a time where witchcraft was welcomed. It was not a time where you could just proudly go around being a witch and everybody was going to be cool about it. That was not a thing. So, Wicca and Wicca being published, popular and public, books being created, helped to give light to a religion that wasn't Christianity, to a religion that was giving a presence for these indigenous practices to not be shamed anymore, to not be killed for being pagan, to not be murdered for practicing your ancestral magic, to not be imprisoned for practicing your indigenous ancestral magic, because Wicca was a thing. So people were kind of starting to be okay with magic and witchcraft. And so it gave a platform for non-Christian religions. And in the chat, we have, I feel like it created a space to be safe, to be weird, to be different. Yes, to think different. There was community, and there wasn't Bible thumpers shoving boundaries down their throat. Yes, agreed. Yes, to not be ostracized for being something other than Christian. Exactly, exactly. So it started this movement, basically, where you would not be imprisoned, ostracized, shamed for being something other than Christian. Exactly. What else? Does anybody have anything else to share? And someone said, basically, it allows you to be yourself in a sense. Yes. It was all the Abrahamic religions. And thank you for bringing that up. So yes, it was just that Christianity and Catholicism were probably the most prominent at that time, as well as Judaism. But yes, you're right. It was every Abrahamic religion. It gave a platform and a place for people to be something other than an Abrahamic religion. Exactly. So now the cons. And of course, I want to start with the cons of even though Cora at least gave credit to the cultures that she was taking these practices from, still, I think that there is a lot to be said about whether or not it's okay to just cherry pick from a whole bunch of different spiritualities from all over the world that have existed for thousands of years, to cherry pick from them, mush them all together, and make up a new name for it. That is problematic. And then, of course, Gerald Gardner, who just made Asia a monolith and who just made Europe a monolith. And to the point that we think, because of Wicca, and I think this is one of the biggest problems, or just a big problem, is that because of Wicca, we have started to think, like I have heard so many times online, that, oh, the pagans celebrate Yule. And that's a large statement. What they really mean to say is that a lot of European, especially Celtic traditions, as well as Scandinavian traditions, and Strega traditions, and Germanic traditions celebrate Yule. Pagan is an umbrella term for all the spiritualities on planet Earth that are not Abrahamic. So pagans don't celebrate Yule. Specific cultures and indigenous communities within different countries in Europe celebrate Yule. So Wicca kind of, because it became so popular, and because because it became so popular, and it kind of started to give people this idea that these were just the ancient tradition, that Wicca was the only ancient tradition that had ever been practiced ever, and that Gerald Gardner was informing us of these ancient holidays that the entire world and all of Asia and all of Africa and all of Europe celebrated and practiced. And that is just false. That is misinformation. That is not true. All of Asia does not celebrate any one thing. Asia is a large continent. Oh, thank you so much. I don't want to pronounce your name wrong, but Shamika or Shemeka. Thank you so much for saying that. And they mentioned that the good part about channeling, one of the pros of fairy Wicca is channeling sexuality. And of course, I'm really happy that I could provide this space. Thank you so much for saying that. Oh, awesome. Good. Shamika. Wonderful. So, yes, that is one of the cons. We have Gerald Gardner, who makes a monolith out of holidays, a monolith out of practices, out of everything, really, and mushes it all together and calls it Wicca, and caused all of the Western world to think that witchcraft is just one thing, and that it's just what we know as Wicca, and that that's all of witchcraft. Also, what Gerald Gardner did, which leads us into this conversation about good magic and bad magic, is Gerald Gardner created this idea of the three folds rule and made everybody think that all witches across the world believe in this rule, and that if anybody does anything that harms anyone, the three folds rule, by the way, if you don't know what it is do what you will but harm none. Anything you do will come back at you three folds. So that took any indigenous practice on planet Earth that had any ritualistic magic that caused harm and turned them into evil witches, who, of course, according to the three folds rule, would have bad things happen to them. This is untrue, by the way, for anybody who did not know that. The three folds rule is Wiccan. It's just Wiccan. Not all pagans believe that, and not all indigenous communities practice that. And that does not make them evil, and that does not make them bad. Magic is just magic. There is no bad and there is no good. Bad and good are just a man-made theology and concept, and perception is going to be different wherever you go. The perception of bad and the perception of good is going to change depending on who you talk to and what culture you are in. And bad and good are just perceptions and theologies and ideologies created by humans. Same thing with perceptions of magic. Magic is just magic. You aren't practicing good magic or bad magic. Even if you are using your magic to harm someone else, I am not saying that that's something that you should do, but there are a lot of indigenous communities that do that, and that doesn't make them evil. And that doesn't mean that we are allowed to disrespect or dishonor their indigenous practices.
Well, like you're saying, you know, it's the perception, like somebody giving money to a homeless man. We'll see that as good. Other people will see that as bad. You're just, you know, enabling him and whatever, you know, so it is just perception, however you look at it.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Becca. Exactly. It is all just perception, and a lot of indigenous communities or even modern communities that practice magic, let's say that you are doing political magic. There's a lot of political magic that's going on all over the world right now. I'm not just talking about like the United States and Europe. All over the world, political magic happens where people are using witchcraft and magic against dictators and against tyranny and using magic for human rights. If you are using magic to hurt a dictator, who are we to say whether that's evil and whether that's good or whether that's bad? There is no good and bad magic. It is all perception, it is all opinion, and it's all human-made and human theology. So Gerald Gardner, as well as Cora, because Cora did hold this idea that the threefolds rule and this idea of good magic and bad magic, they made everybody very scared of any practice that didn't hold this threefolds rule, or that didn't hold the rule harm none, which painted a lot of indigenous cultures to be evil and bad. What other cons can you guys think of now that I have talked forever? It's your turn.
Well, I think
Well,
that is the same
oh,
as the good. Like they have the religion, yes, but some people don't want to be in a religion based witchcraft. Like, you know, some of us are solitary. We don't want to have to answer to a high priest and a high priestess for the Gardnerian. And, you know, some people don't feel comfortable expressing themselves sexually. So those are some cons, I think.
Totally. I can agree with that. Yeah. And yes, I totally agree, Cynthia. Exactly. And I love how you explain dichotomy so well. And there is no good without evil. There has to be both. Really, in order for you to interpret something as good or bad, one does not exist without the other. I so wholeheartedly agree. We have so many classes on that. And that is one of the reasons why there is no good magic and bad magic, or even good and bad as generalized terms, because good would not exist without the idea of bad, and bad would not exist without the idea of good. Exactly. I love it. Thank you. You're right. And you bring that up, Paul. I love that you brought that up, that it is misinterpreted and not as it's written. That a lot of people say that when Gerald Gardner wrote that, that's not what he meant. That I'm assuming here that you're talking about, that you're talking about the three folds over rule and harm none. We don't know for sure if that's how he meant it or not, because Gerald Gardner did kind of try to explain that that's not how he meant it, but once it got so popularized, and that's kind of how everybody took it, and it spread so quickly, Gerald Gardner kind of just went with it. And it's not that Gerald Gardner went with it. That was a bad way of saying it. Gardnerian Wicca kind of just went with it. So because Gardnerian Wicca kind of just went with it, his legacy will go down as being interpreted in that way. Whereas Gerald Gardner himself even said that he didn't mean it that way. He made many books and many passages where he tried to explain what he really meant, but because Gardnerian Wicca as a whole and its practitioners continued to write books and speak about it as if that's how he meant it, his legacy will go down as meaning it that way. And yeah, exactly, Kat. And I love that you brought that up. That's another con in my eyes, is that one of the reasons why a lot of people were drawn to Wicca is because it used a lot of the same fear tactics that Christianity uses. It uses these fear tactics to get you to act a certain way, and gets you to act a certain way out of fear. Because if you do anything bad, it will come back at you three folds over. And it's very similar to the fear tactics that Abrahamic religions use. If you do anything bad, you will go to hell. You will go to a bad place. Your life will be bad. And so it reminds me very much of these fear tactics that Abrahamic religions use. And so, yeah. Yes, and I love that you brought that up. I would love if you elaborated a little bit more on that, Lisa. So that is a criticism that a lot of people have said, that, not a criticism, a point that a lot of people have brought up when it comes to fairy Wicca, is that it becomes very matriarchal, which is fine, but that because it's the 50s and they didn't, or actually fairy Wicca is the 60s, but because it's the 60s, and at that time they weren't really sure, because of the societies that they came from, because of the teachings that they came from, because they were just cherry picking from other traditions and didn't fully understand the traditions that they were cherry picking from, they didn't fully understand the idea of someone being non-binary. So when they describe non-binary, it sounds very much like they are just describing a female. And a lot of their witchcraft is solely and only based off of the female, even though they do make a point to say that it's not a female. It is a non-binary person, which is a beautiful thing. And I'm really happy that they did that, because that must have been really difficult to do in the 60s. But that they didn't quite understand how to make a mythological being non-binary, because they didn't fully understand the traditions they were cherry picking from. They were cherry picking from traditions that had mythological beings that were non-binary. But because they didn't fully understand it, they just had slightly read bits and pieces of it, they were not immersed in the culture. They didn't quite understand what the terminology of non-binary actually meant. And in their books and teachings, it comes across a lot more as feminine and female, which is just a point I am making. I'm not necessarily saying that's a pro or a con. It is just an observation. I think a con would be, though, that both Gerald Gardner and Cora and Victor, what they did is just like I said, they didn't even understand the traditions they were taking from. And that becomes another big problem. And it becomes a problem that differs. So like if you guys say that you are an eclectic witch, which a lot of us are eclectic witches. If you're an eclectic witch, which means that you study multiple cultures and multiple traditions of open practices of witchcraft, then what you are doing is trying really, really hard to immerse yourself into that culture, to understand that culture, to understand that tradition, to truly gain knowledge of that tradition, and to truly understand its teachings. Whereas I think that's something that Gerald Gardner and Cora did not do. They took little bits and pieces from a lot of traditions that they did not understand, traditions that they did not fully immerse themselves in, that they did not fully gain knowledge about and fully research. And so therefore they ended up taking little bits and pieces, creating the religion Wicca, and then not understanding the traditions that they took from and not being able to practice them correctly and not being able to even explain them correctly or to give other people knowledge on them in a correct way.
Okay.
So Sarah Jones asked a awesome question. So she said, but is there not some level of karmic energy involved in everything that you put out? Not necessarily a punishment or a reward, just an energy that is equal to what you put out. So I love that question. Thank you so much for asking. So all I am saying is that there is no, so short answer is no, but long answer is yes. So the short answer is that not everybody believes that, and that's okay. Not every person and every tradition and every pagan and every culture is going to believe that there is some form of karmic energy involved in everything and that is equal to what you put out. No. And the fact that they don't believe that is okay and beautiful and wonderful and fantastic and totally fine. And their practice is just as valid as yours. Some people do believe that, and that is also wonderful and fantastic and totally fine. And it is just all of it. Every single piece of it is your perception, is your practice, your magic. And if you believe that there is some form of karmic energy that gives you back every single thing that you put out, or even just energy that comes back at you when you put energy out, that is wonderful. And that's part of your practice and your belief. And that is just your perception, your ideology. And somebody else and another culture and another practice might think that there's not. And that doesn't make their practice evil and your practice good. It is just there, and it just is. No, that's totally not bad at all. I think that a lot of people don't think of a lot of their practices as opinions. And I think that that's something that we have to start being okay with and understanding, is that every single part of your perception, every part of your own philosophy, your own practice, your own theology, in essence, it is an opinion. And it's okay for someone else to disagree. And it is okay for somebody else to have another opinion.
Okay.
There are some things that are obviously facts. Many things. There are lots of things that are facts, and I am not saying that they're not. There are a lot of things that are facts, and we also have to be okay with that as well. But also, a lot of things are perception, and a lot of things are just theology and opinion. And being able to have complex conversations where we discuss and talk about opinions and complex ideologies and theologies without thinking that one is bad and what is good is a very important skill for an intelligent person to have, is just being able to have conversations about opinions and about theology and philosophy and witchcraft and magic and all of these things without thinking that one is scary, that one is bad because you don't understand it or because it's not what you practice.
I have a question.
Yes.
I was just wondering, and this was brought up in, I'm a part of some Wicca group on Facebook and stuff, where people that are beginners, they get to share stuff and whatnot. And okay, I've always done my own practicing and learned on my own and done my own spells. It wasn't because of something I read or got into. It wasn't something because I ran across it. I've always had a passion for it, and I've always just learned on my own. And later on, I did a bunch of spells that related to my situations I was going through in life to help me with certain situations. But I was raised by my grandmother, and I was brought up in church all my life. So I've been taught like the teachings of God, and I've always, had a cross, and I've always had my relationship with God. And then I've also always had my relationship with my own practicing and my own stuff that I like to do. And people ask me, they're like, well, what kind of witch are you? And then they were like, do you believe in God too? And I'm like, well, yeah, I believe in God. And they're like, okay, well, you're pagan. Now, I looked up like the eccentric witch, and I think that it applies to me because I don't study, like, you got your crystal witches, you got different kinds of witches, and I don't really classify as anything. I try everything and try to learn everything. And I can, with spells, I don't just work with one element. I work with everything and try to learn everything. And I was just wondering, like, what would you be categorized, or would you be categorized of anything? I mean, is it okay to practice witchcraft when you're also been brought up with God and you believe in God? Like, I guess, what do you guys think about people that believe in God and do witchcraft?
That is such a beautiful question. Thank you for asking that. So, number one, I think that part of someone's practice and part of someone's path is discovering what they want to identify as. And sometimes you never do. Like I said, I have been a witch since I was a little kid. I grew up pagan. My parents are pagan, and that's just how I grew up. And I still to this day do not have a name for what I think I am. I have gone by many. I have gone by eclectic witch. When I was a little kid, I went by Wiccan. I have been fairy Wiccan as I got a little bit older as well, because for other reasons. I have studied with different fairy covens. I have called myself just pagan. That's kind of what I'm going with now, is that I'm just pagan. But it is your decision and up to you, whatever you would like to classify yourself as. I actually have a little pet peeve when it comes to a lot of these like tests and quizzes that are like, what kind of witch are you? Because really that's up for you to decide. And you know, you can work with crystals and not call yourself a crystal witch. It is up to you and your path to decide whatever you would like to identify as. And number two, so like I have previously stated, I do not believe that there is an okay and a not okay. It just is. So, of course, you can believe in God and also practice witchcraft. We are about to, after this conversation, which we're kind of wrapping up now, we are going to talk about the difference between paganism, witchcraft, and Wicca. So you can practice witchcraft and be part of any religion in the world. Witchcraft is not a religion. And so you can practice witchcraft and be and believe in whatever you want to believe in on earth. You can practice witchcraft and believe in the giant spaghetti monster. You can practice witchcraft and believe in anything that you want. But one thing I will say is that if you are practicing witchcraft and you believe in the Christian God and you practice Christianity or Christian anything, that just to make sure that you are also informing yourself and becoming informed and gaining knowledge about what Christianity as a whole, what the entirety of the religion throughout history has done to people who practice witchcraft, what they have done to paganism. Understand and realize that witches and pagans and indigenous communities all over the world have gone through extreme genocide because of Christianity, that Christianity colonized the world and killed the pagans of the world and the indigenous communities of the world. And understand that if you take from these pagan communities, which means, you know, practicing witchcraft and taking from these indigenous spiritualities, then you also have to respect and honor the fact that they were killed and prosecuted and ostracized for these practices. Give respect, give honor, and do that by becoming informed about what Christianity did as a whole to these communities.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
There was a book I read, I don't remember what it was called, but it was very Christian based and it was witchcraft. Wasn't witchcraft originally very Christian? Or Christian? I don't remember.
So that's, yeah, so because Christianity in itself, as well as Judaism, have existed for such a long time,
Yeah.
they have, over thousands of years and even thousands of years ago, they mixed with each other. A lot of people, especially some of the biggest accounts that we have of this, is throughout the Middle East
hmm
and throughout Central and South America. Things like Santeria, things which is a form of witchcraft that is mixed with Catholicism. You have things like throughout the southern United States, like hoodoo, that are a lot of Abrahamic religion that is mixed with a lot of indigenous African religions, especially from Ethiopia and from Uganda, because of the slave trade. So because these religions are so old, and even things like Strega witchcraft was a mixture of Catholicism and witchcraft from the Middle East. And a lot of Middle Eastern traditions, such as tarot, were around during the time of Christianity. And so a lot of these things got mixed, and a lot of practices that you see are a mixture of both Abrahamic religions and witchcraft. That's why witchcraft is not a religion in itself. It is a practice that any religion on earth can practice. So yes, if you're talking about something like Santeria, then
Yeah.
you are talking about a Abrahamic religion that is mixed with witchcraft. But if you're talking about something like, let's say, Celtic practices, that would not originate with Christianity. That would originate with indigenous Celtic magic that came long before any Christianity ever existed. Same thing with Norse mythology and a lot of Middle Eastern indigenous magic and Egyptian indigenous magic all came long before Christianity or Judaism ever existed. And so it depends on what type of witchcraft.
It came from the book that I read. Well, some of the book I read. I didn't read it all. It came from the complete book of Black Magic and Witchcraft. But it seemed very. I know I don't. But it seemed very religious, like very old, Christian.
Yeah. I would say that a lot of those books are probably taking from a lot of different religions, such as
Yeah.
Santeria and Strega and hoodoo and things like that,
Mhm.
and taking a lot of the Christianity and Abrahamic religions that are embedded in those traditions and kind of making a book out of squishing them all together.
Yeah. I just wanted to bring it up, to give her something to, go off of if she did want to continue with the Christianity and the Wicca as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I love that point. Exactly, because Christianity and Judaism have existed for so long. Yeah, there is a lot of witchcraft that you can do that is already blended with Christianity. Yep. So thank you. Let's see. So now when we do talk about that, though, I do want to give a disclaimer that even though, yes, things like Santeria, things like hoodoo, things like Strega, even though they do have a lot of mixing with Christianity, we also have to remember why. So always remember why when you are practicing these religions. And like I said, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. This does not make Santeria bad in any way, shape, or form. But remember that the reason why hoodoo is a mixture of a lot of Christian theology and witchcraft is because of the slave trade. It is because of genocide. It is because the Christian usually European Christians came to these countries and colonized and enslaved people. And in an attempt to hold on to their own indigenous practice, they mixed the Christianity, the Abrahamic religions with witchcraft, and it evolved over thousands of years and became what we know today. But remember, it comes from colonization. It comes from assimilation. It comes from a lot of these indigenous cultures being ostracized, being colonized, being killed, and not being able to practice their own indigenous ancestral religions. So even though it is a beautiful and wonderful and awesome thing, if you want to go learn about a lot of practices that are mixed with these things, just make sure that you're not practicing anything that's a closed practice. A lot of different aspects of Santeria are a closed practice. A lot of different aspects of hoodoo and voodoo are closed practices. So make sure that you're not practicing those. But if you are going to practice an open practice and an open spirituality that is a mixture of an indigenous practice and an Abrahamic practice, just remember that the reason that those two things are mixed is due to assimilation and colonization. And just respect that, just know that, just have knowledge of that and use it as a way to give Indigenous people a voice and to respect and learn about their traditions.
Can I say something?
Oh, of course. Always.
So, I come from a long line of ancestral Scandinavian paganism, and I feel like when I was listening to all of that, I personally feel like associating the neo-paganism, the new paganism, somewhat of that kind of combination, because the things that I've grown up with and learned, and as just knowing, thinking everybody lived that way, and completely different. And I feel like a lot of the neo-paganism and the neo-new time practices and spiritualities utilize the welded together sense of, Christianity and, a bunch of different stuff that is kind of blended, kind of like Wicca. Would you agree?
Definitely. I wholeheartedly agree. A lot of neo-paganism in itself is a mashup of a lot of different spiritualities and cultures, especially Scandinavian. So I can see why you would feel that way. Because a lot of Scandinavian practices, it's really sad. That's why I always say knowledge. Make sure to educate yourself. If you are somebody who is not from a Scandinavian background, you don't have Scandinavian ancestors and family, and you want to practice a Scandinavian religion, don't go learn it from the mismatch of neo-pagan groups on Facebook. Go learn from somebody who is from Scandinavia. Go learn from somebody who actually is part of that culture. Go learn from them and raise their voice. Go on Facebook to these groups and make sure that everybody knows that you learned from them and that their voice is heard and that it's not coming from you, that it's coming from this amazing teacher that you had who is from an ancestral family from Scandinavia. And instead of learning from these neo-pagan groups that are just a mismatch of a lot of people trying to learn, elevate the voices of the people who are actually from these cultures and learn from them. So I completely agree with you. And yes.
I love that. I do love that opinion that you just praised and stated. And I have no problem with neo-paganism or any. I have a podcast that literally emphasizes on all religions, all spiritualities. Everyone's welcome, but I do absolutely love and respect and appreciate what you just emphasized on, for sure, because I think that we lose a lot of that with time and the melding of everything.
We do. I agree. And I think that it's very important to learn from people who are actually from these cultures. I don't think that there's absolutely anything wrong, like you said, with neo-paganism. And I think that it's actually kind of beautiful that people have I think neo-paganism has brought such a beautiful community to the world. It really has. So many people get to just be themselves and learn about all of these beautiful practices that have existed for thousands of years. And it's amazing. And it's so much fun to see. But also remember that you are taking from people's culture. So let's learn from people of that culture and elevate the people of that culture's voices.
Would it be possible to make a comment here?
Yes, of course, please.
So I was listening in and it reminded me of I've been talking to a friend of mine who is Korean, and she celebrates like the Lunar New Year and lunar celebrations, as well as like Mid-Autumn Festival in Chuseok, which is in like layman's terms like Korean Thanksgiving, where they have like this sort of big celebration of family and all these things going on. And when I was talking to her about like whether it would be okay for me to take part in some of these celebrations, she said that if you were to wear, say, like some of the like the dresses or the what they call hanbok is like traditional materials used during like these practices or these like festivities, like it just has to be authentic or made by someone who is Korean or someone who like is part of the culture. So it's a lot of like kind of similar to what you were saying, that so long as you're like learning from and respecting the wishes of like the people who are part of like a certain culture or a part of a certain religion, then it's like a little more okay. But if they are closed off, then you respect that they're closed off.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much for sharing that. Exactly. And I love that you're learning about it from somebody who is from that culture and practices those traditions, and that's awesome. That's beautiful, and thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Exactly. Yeah. So we are going to move now to, and please, if you still have comments to make, I know I don't read every single thing that flows through the chat out loud. I am reading what you guys say. I'm not reading all of it out loud. I want to make sure these classes don't go too far over 2 hours. So, but if you have any more comments to make about Wicca and the pros and cons of Wicca, and even about cultural appropriation and about everything that we have been talking about, please feel free to chime in and say absolutely anything that you want to. But we are going to move into the difference between witchcraft, paganism, and Wicca. So, as we have already learned, Wicca is a religion that was created in the 50s. That is a cherry picking of a lot of different indigenous religion, or a lot of different indigenous spiritualities from all over the world that they mix together to create a religion called Wicca. There are many different branches of Wicca, and they are evolving over time. That is Wicca. Paganism. Paganism is, and we have a specific class on the YouTube, please go watch it, where I discuss the entire history of paganism for hours. So please go watch that, because I am not going to do that now. But paganism is an umbrella term. It is an umbrella term that we use that means absolutely any spirituality on planet Earth that is not Abrahamic. Any of them. So this includes things like Buddhism, Hinduism, and it also includes things such as Celtic practices. It also includes things such as high ceremonial magic and alchemy and sigilization and all these different things that might be part of an actual practice. So actually, like, sigilization is going to be like witchcraft. But any spirituality on earth that isn't Abrahamic, we use an umbrella term, paganism. And now, the people of these cultures did not name themselves pagan. So there's a lot of pros and cons to even using the word pagan. The only reason I use it, and even most people who have a lot of knowledge about esoteric and metaphysical work use the word pagan, is for lack of a better term. If you do not know the specific name for the spirituality itself, then you use the word pagan. if you know the name of the spirituality that those people have identify with and want you to use, please use that word. If you do not know the word and it is just a non-Abrahamic spirituality, we don't, just use the term pagan. But it is all of them. That means that Wicca falls under the term pagan. So all Wiccans are pagan, but not all pagans are Wiccan. Does that make sense? So absolutely all spiritualities on earth that are not Abrahamic, which means they are not a branch of Islam, Christianity, Catholicism, or Judaism. If they are not a branch of one of those, then it's pagan. And that is what paganism is. So there are forms of ancient paganism throughout every country in the world. So all before Christianity and before Judaism. And for those of you who don't know, when I say Judaism, the only reason I have to bring this up is because it's been a question that I've been asked so many times. There is a difference between the Jewish ethnicity of people, that is an ethnic group of people, and Judaism, the religion. Okay, there's a difference between those two things. I am not talking about the ethnicity, the Jewish ethnicity. I am talking about Judaism, the religion. Okay, just yes. So, all countries on earth, all places on earth were pagan before the birth of Judaism, Christianity, Catholicism, Islam, and Abrahamic branches of those religions. So every country in the world was pagan. So there are thousands of different traditions, thousands of different customs, different practices that
I want to bring up that Christianity is based off of pagan rituals and stuff. You know what I mean?
it is. Yep. We actually have a class on that too, and how most traditions within Christianity, especially things like their holidays, celebrations, and even their saints. When you talk about Catholicism, their ritual work, the practices that they have, all stemmed from pagan practices. Exactly. Yep.
Because I remember reading a Greek book, and it was like had a whole bunch of different gods in it, and it was actually just like the Bible, it just with different, like many gods instead of just one.
Yep. Or
They stole from.
I have a class where I teach about Odin, and Odin. If you read the stories of Odin, you can tell where they got a lot of the stories of Jesus, which is very, very interesting. But yeah, exactly. Yep. So that is why a lot of times people use the term neo-pagan, because paganism is every single spirituality that's ever existed that's not Abrahamic. So we're even talking about ancient humans and some of the very, very first Homo sapiens on Earth that would have done small burials or small rituals that involved worshiping the sun or worshiping the rain or anything like that. They would all be discussed in a historical sense and a scholarly sense as pagan. But please go watch the class on paganism, because I go into why that is. I just don't have time in this class to discuss why that is. It's a very long story. So paganism is loosely defined as an earth-based spirituality that is polytheistic and even in some cases semi-atheistic. And I actually realized sometime after making this page, because I made this quite a while ago, I'm wrong here. I have to erase this. I am wrong. Oops. I realized a lot of books state this, and I want you to know that we have now realized, due to anthropology and due to historians bringing up new research, because that always happens, and whenever new research comes out and new science comes out, I am always perfectly fine with realizing I was wrong. And I put down here that paganism is any non-monotheistic spirituality. That is wrong. There is actually quite a few of monotheistic religions that existed long before Abrahamic religions. So especially throughout the Middle East. And so that is wrong. Please, I'm going to erase that. That is untrue. And we have the science now to prove that that is not true. By the way, monotheistic, for those of you who don't know, means the worship of one God and one creation God, a God that created the world, and you do not have multiple gods. There is only one God. So yeah, exactly. Days of the week, months, names, holidays, seasons. And yes, there is such a thing as secular paganism, for sure. Paganism, because like I said, there's millions of different pagan traditions. So yes, in short, yes, there is such a thing as secular paganism. But if you mean that as in the sense that if it is related to an Abrahamic religion, then if it's a branch of, because like I said, so this is where things get a little, I don't know, a little complicated, because we decided to take one umbrella term and one word and give one word to every single indigenous practice on earth. And of course, that is problematic and is going to cause issues. So, when I say an Abrahamic branch, I don't mean witchcraft mixed with Christianity. Things like Santeria are still going to be categorized as pagan. Things like hoodoo and voodoo are still going to be categorized as pagan, and same things with things like strega, still pagan. I know that they mix in Abrahamic traditions because of colonization and assimilation and all of that, but they are still considered pagan because they're not an actual branch that Christianity and Catholicism would accept as a branch of Catholicism or Christianity. So that is paganism. So now we know the definition of Wicca, we know the definition of paganism. Witchcraft. So witchcraft is not a spirituality. It's not a religion. It is not linked to any spirituality or religion, not necessarily. A lot of spiritualities have witchcraft within their tradition and within their practice, but witchcraft on its own does not have a denomination. It is not necessarily a part of anything. It is on its own. So you can be Catholic and practice witchcraft. The Catholics might not love it, even though they totally practice very strange rituals. Not strange. I shouldn't say that. That's rude. They have rituals of their own that they practice where, they like do things that to me seem very much like witchcraft, but they would not like that. So that's probably disrespectful. But anyway,
I agree with that wholeheartedly. All the ups and the downs and the Hail Marys and all that stuff, and the burning of the incense, walking around like it's they're smudging the place,
yeah. So but anyone can practice witchcraft. Practicing witchcraft does not make you Wiccan. Practicing witchcraft does not make you pagan. Practicing witchcraft is just practicing witchcraft. So you can be part of any spirituality or any practice and practice witchcraft. Witchcraft is using any form of magic. That can be esoteric magic, metaphysical magic, high magic. It can be earth-based elemental magic. It can be divination magic. It can be, so when I say, I know, that was probably a lot of words that a lot of people didn't fully grasp, but like divination magic is going to be things like using tarot cards, using Elder Futhark runes, using pendulum, using crystal reading, using a crystal ball, using oracle cards, using anything like that. That is going to be divination magic, which would be considered witchcraft. Performing rituals, and within those rituals, doing things like manifestation, doing things like spells, doing things like creating moon water that is going to help to manifest different things based on the power of that phase of the moon. That is all going to be witchcraft. Any form of magic that you practice is going to be witchcraft. That'll include things like sigilization and alchemy. And that'll include things like, there's a lot. So there's a lot of different forms of magic, and all of it is considered witchcraft. Good, I'm so glad. I'm glad that helps. Awesome. Yes, so does anybody have any questions about the difference between Wicca, paganism, and witchcraft?
Wicca is pretty much witchcraft anyway, right? Wicca is pretty much the practice of witchcraft, isn't it?
So Wicca is a religion that took from many different indigenous spiritualities, mixed them all together, and gave it a new name and called it Wicca. They practice witchcraft within their religion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes better sense then. So what would it mean? So what's the difference between practicing witchcraft? What a pageant is pageant like based off of the Christianity beliefs? Is that what makes the people, what makes a person pagan?
So someone who's pagan is any spirituality or religion on earth that is not a branch of Islam, Judaism, Catholicism, or Christianity. Any spirituality or religion on earth that is not one of those.
Okay, so if I'm not one of those, then I would be considered pagan too then, or I'm sorry, I'm probably saying it wrong, pagan then?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
So Orthodox. So any branch. So yes. So like, let's say you are an Orthodox Jew, or you are Orthodox Catholic. You are Catholic Orthodox. That would still fall under a branch of Catholicism or Judaism. So that would not be pagan. Any branch. So that includes things like, I don't know, a lot of the that includes things like Mormon is even not pagan, because technically they are considered a branch of Christianity. Something like Episcopalian. I don't know a lot of the branches of Christianity. Christianity is not the thing I know about. I know about pagan spiritualities, and I am a pagan professor. And nobody in my entire family is Christian, so I was never brought up on any of it. But any of the branches of Christianity, including the Orthodox ones, and including any Orthodox or branch of Catholicism or Islam, all of those are not going to fall under the umbrella term of paganism. Yes. So, okay, that is a wonderful question. Thank you so much for asking that. They asked earlier, you said that tarot was based on a Middle Eastern tradition. What kinds of traditions? I encourage you. So that's, okay, I'll give you a really short answer. So about 2000, about 1700 to 2000 years ago, in the Middle East, they started developing the ideology of numerology. And they started to associate numbers with different metaphysical meanings. And then they created, they used normal playing cards that were originally created in China to play a game. And this game used the suits and the numbers on the cards to predict your future. And they used it at festivals and at feasts and at celebrations to read your future. And they would use the numerology and the suit on the card to read your past, your present, your future, your personality, things about you, and all of that. And it slowly evolved through numerology, Egyptian and Greek astrology, and Middle Eastern theology into what we know now as tarot. But the minor arcana cards started as a Middle Eastern divination game using the suits and the numbers on the cards to read your past, present, future, and your personality and all of that. And all numerology that we use in the Western world originated in the Middle East, specifically in Iran and throughout different places of ancient Arabia. The longer story, and if you would love to hear the longer story, my tarot card classes go very, very, very deep into that. It's something that I have been practicing. It's one of my very, very first divinations that I ever used. My family is also from the Middle East. I am Middle Eastern and I am Arabic, and so I love learning about my own culture. And so it's something that I've studied heavily. If you would like to hear the longer story and you would like to hear my big giant lecture on numerology from the Middle East and how it has moved through Europe and the United States and how we use it to read tarot, come to my live tarot classes or watch them on our YouTube. Oh my gosh, that's so cool. I'm Lebanese too. I'm Lebanese and Syrian. That's amazing. It's so nice to meet you. I enjoy reading tarot too. So, yes, does anybody have any questions about Wicca, paganism, and witchcraft?
Okay, I was reading something and it was saying that adherents and heathens and whatnot refer to themselves as practitioners and not believers. Okay, that makes sense because it says here that in the Wiccan religion, which you had mentioned, harm none and do you well. Like they have their own religion of their rituals and beliefs, I guess, which would make them a religion, is from my understanding. So if I don't really go by the religion of it and I just practice it and study it, then I guess I would be considered, I can consider myself a practitioner and not a part of the Wicca religion, right?
You can study witchcraft and not be Wiccan.
Yeah.
So you just are using them.
learning.
Yeah, you're just using the magic of it and not you're really worshiping anything necessarily. You could worship any god if you're a witch. But if you're a Wiccan, you have a masculine and a feminine normally. And in a sense, I'm learning that the fairy one, the fairy Wicca, that one is just mixed into one, but it's still masculine and feminine in a way, just mixed into one god.
Exactly. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you. I'm really happy that I jumped in this class because this did clear a lot of stuff up, because you'd be surprised on how many people on Facebook are confused by all this, but I'm just learning and studying it myself, and I'm happy that you guys actually make a class to help people understand this better.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. And I have noticed one of the reasons that I decided to host these classes on what is Wicca and what is paganism is because I was very frustrated with how confused a lot of people are on Facebook, not because it's their fault, but just because of the amount of misinformation that exists on the internet.
Even people that study witchcraft in themselves think sometimes that they're Wiccan, and they're not necessarily. They just have been misled.
Yep, I think that Wicca spread across Europe and the US at such a very vulnerable time for um, for the world, and at such a time where it was so hard to obtain information, that there was a lot of misinformation that ended up spreading, and it spread fast. And now that we have access to, most of the knowledge, well, to a lot of knowledge just on our phones, I think that hopefully we can start to debunk a lot of these things that people have started to believe since the 60s.
Mhm.
This is not taught in schools. At least, okay, I don't know if this is taught in schools outside of the US. But in the US, this is not taught in schools, or at least, I mean, I guess I went to school mostly in Massachusetts, Colorado, and yeah, that's about it. So I know it's not taught in schools, in public schools in Massachusetts and Colorado.
I just had a cool history teacher.
That's awesome. That is so awesome that you learned about this. We would touch on the fact that, like, people were pagan before Christianity existed, and that's about it. That's about all that they gave, and they definitely did not talk about Wicca or witchcraft. Definitely not.
Mm-mm.
So I'm going to stop the recording now.